everyone, welcome to episode 5 of Plaque Stage Pass, which by now you should know is the accompanying series to Plaque to the Future, where we look at the untold stories of people from history who have got blue plaques. And today we're talking all about Elisabeth Welch. So I'm Imogen. I've hosted the last 4 of these, so I won't go through all that again. If you guys would like to introduce yourselves, because I shouldn't be the one to do that. I don't mind who starts.
I am a historian of Black Britain. I've written many Black British history books over 30 years, and I've also written some biographies, including a biography of Elisabeth Welch, which was published in 2005, based on much research, but also my own personal friendship with her, which lasted quite a while in the latter part of her life.
Brilliant. I can't believe we've got Stephen. It's so exciting. Tatenda.
Honestly, it's really awesome to be in this room with you both. Yes, hi, I'm Tatenda. I'm an actor, a young producer with Shout Out Loud, writer of plays and performer of poems. And I will be, or you've heard me, voicing Elisabeth Welch on this Plaque to the Future podcast. Well, YouTube series. I look forward to going into these questions with you.
Cool. And Tatenda, you can kick off the questions as a much more glamorous human being than me.
Stop! Okay, number 1 for you, Stephen, is firstly, to give us a better picture of the industry in which Elisabeth was working, can you tell us what working as a singer would have been like in the UK in the 1930s?
There would have been many opportunities, because in the 1930s in Britain, you had music hall theatres all over the country, which reached mass audiences. Radio, BBC Radio had been launched in 1922, so by the 1930s, it was another way of reaching out to the mass public from Land's End to John O'Groats. Television was launched by the BBC in 1936, but the pre-war service was very limited in its audience, very middle-class, London-only audience, but was still another. And of course, there were theatres, so singers could get work in reviews, musical reviews, as Elisabeth did, in London's West End or in other parts of the country. She went to Blackpool Opera House, so she didn't just confine herself to London. And film, many films made in the 1930s in Britain, because they had a quota system, which meant that you'd get like expensive high budget films made, prestige films, but you also had many low budget films, including because they had to reach a certain quota. I don't understand all of that, but the British film industry was very productive, and Elisabeth again appeared in some of these low budget musical review type films, one of which is lost because some of these films were just not considered worthy of being kept, so they're lost forever. So a huge, and of course recordings, the old 78, as we knew them, 78 recordings, discs. This has preceded CDs and everything that we now have. So the recording boom was huge. I think I've more or less covered everything. So if you were a singer in Britain, there were lots of opportunities to practice your craft.
And obviously, in the episode of Plaque to the Future, where Ada, the protagonist, speaks to Elisabeth, she's speaking to her in 1934. She's sort of already got that established career. But I just wanted to know a bit more about what happened in her childhood and led her into that. So what would her childhood have looked like in America, and how would her sort of quite artistic aspirations have been viewed by parents and teachers at the time?
Elisabeth told me that she had a very happy childhood in New York. She came from a very poor district of New York. If you watch the opening credits of the film West Side Story, they filmed that famous shot over the New York, looking down from a helicopter, tenements. And that's where Elisabeth grew up, 63rd Street West. And then they tore those tenements down and built on top of them in New York City. But the important thing to know about Elisabeth is she didn't come from an African-American community. She told me that she came from a very mixed community. She was friends with the Irish, the Italians, the Swiss. I mean, it was a real, what they used to call in the old days, melting pot, a real mixture of ethnicities. And she herself was of mixed heritage. Her mother was half Scottish, half Irish. Her father was half African-American, half Native American Indian. Mm. So she never felt as though she was belonging to one particular ethnicity. She saw herself as a woman of the world who embraced all cultures, all people, regardless of their background. She had a very happy childhood. And the way she got into musical theatre is very interesting. She was in the church choir, the local church choir, and she was known as the loud alto because she had a loud voice. And so the choir, in the 1920s, you had what was known as the Harlem Renaissance. Mm. And the Harlem Renaissance included many, many, many Black musical reviews and shows. And one of the earliest successes was Running Wild, 1923. So the choir that Elisabeth was part of, and she's still a teenager, she's about 18, 19 at this time, was pulled into this show to sing in the background. And they heard this loud alto, Elisabeth, young Elisabeth, and they needed a singer to stand at the front of the stage in Running Wild and sing the Charleston, the Charleston. She didn't dance it. There are some claims that she launched the Charleston. Well, she launched the song, but she said once she finished the song, Charleston, Charleston, down in Carolina, they yanked her off and brought in the chorus girls to dance the Charleston, famous Charleston, and it launched the dance craze. But if you look at photographs, I've got photographs of her doing that song. She's actually standing in front of the chorus girls with her leg up, pretending to be dancing. But she said that was the one thing she could never do. She never mastered the art of dancing. And that was her lead into show business. But in her family, her father, who was very, very religious, in those days, in many families, Black and white, if your daughter went on the stage, she was considered a prostitute. You know, she was a loose woman. And so he disowned her. It was very, very sad. It's one of the few things she talked about, which was a sad moment in her life when her father, who she loved very much, walked out on the family. She had two brothers. She was born in between two brothers, Edward and John. And he just upped and left, and they never saw him again. Her brother John tried to find him, couldn't, no trace of him. And so that was the sort of sad story that she told. But she said she was happy to continue performing in these shows to help her mother.
This raises to me a question in regards to, of course, Elisabeth had a very diverse upbringing in terms of where she lived in the tenement buildings. But then what was the transition in terms of moving to the United Kingdom and the artistic scene there? Was there a lot of diversity in racial diversity in the arts industry when she arrived in the United Kingdom?
There was. I mean, I have written about this. There was a huge number of African-American expatriates, for example. Paul Robeson had made his home here. He was probably the most famous Black person in Britain in the 1930s. You had from the Caribbean, you had Leslie Hutchinson, who was a very famous and very popular cabaret artist. and Cole Porter, who also wrote a song for Elisabeth, wrote songs for Leslie Hutchinson. Cole Porter was one of the most famous songwriters of that time, and many others, Nina Mae McKinney from America, Alberta Hunter. Some of them just passed through for maybe a few years and then went back. See, when the war came in 1939, a lot of the African-American expatriates went back to America, but including Paul Robeson, but the Caribbean and Black British artists were here to stay and stayed. And Elisabeth was one of the very few African-American expatriates that stayed here. And when I asked her that, she said, why she stayed? She said, because I'd made my home here. She came here in 1933 and never went back to America, because she said the British public embraced her, and she became very popular as a singer in this country. And she said, and the one job led to another. There was work. She never ever said that if she'd gone back to America, she wouldn't have had a career. But knowing how American racial politics worked at that time, she probably wouldn't have had the opportunities in film, in theatre, in television, in radio that she had in this country. So without giving a long list of Black artists in Britain in the 1930s, believe me, there were many, many. And some of them, as I say, were born here, like Evelyn Dove, who I've written a book about. So it was a very diverse entertainment world, if you like, in Britain.
And you've obviously spoken about the sort of vast array of opportunities that there were for singers at the time. But how, it's sort of abundantly clear in episode 5 that how eclectic Elisabeth's career and talents are. Can you tell us a bit about how she got into radio and into film, and what it was about her that made her so good at it?
She had a very good launch because she was singing in cabaret shows in Paris. She went to Paris for the first time in 1928 with one of those New York revues, Blackbirds of 1928. She wasn't the star. Adelaide Hall was the star, and it went to the famous Moulin Rouge theatre, and Elisabeth was in the cast. But she loved Paris because there's a lot of African Americans discovered, including Josephine Baker, who had already established herself in Paris in 1925. The Black artists from America discovered freedom. They were not segregated, they were not treated badly by the French people. The French people loved them and embraced them. And Elisabeth warmed to that. And that's where her cabaret career began. She was first and foremost a cabaret singer. And that's how she learned the art of singing and performing. She was seen by Cole Porter, as I've mentioned, the songwriter. And it was Cole Porter who was instrumental in bringing her to London in 1933 to appear in a show that he'd written for a very famous stage star called Gertrude Lawrence. And it was called Nymph Errant. It opened in London at the Adelphi Theatre. So this was a big, big show. And Elisabeth just had one song called Solomon. And she come in a harem, without going into the long, convoluted plot. So she walks on, meets Gertrude Lawrence, and then sings this famous song, Solomon. And it launched her. She immediately was picked up by BBC Radio. 1933, she was given her own series in 1934 called Soft Lights and Sweet Music. Well, that title tells you everything, Soft Lights and Sweet Music. She had this lovely, soft, lovely voice, which listeners, this is before television, just before television, so people would listen to the wireless, as it was called then. It wasn't called radio, it was called wireless, the wireless. And Elisabeth would sing on the radio, and she said that is what established her as a name right across the British Isles, from Land's End to John O'Groats. They would hear, and so she then got offers to do music hall performances, That didn't always work out well. She said that one of the toughest gigs she had ever had was Birmingham. She was invited to a theatre in Birmingham in 1935, I think, on the strength of a radio series, and she said the audiences were known in show business circles to sit on their hands. And I said, well, why did they do that? She said they didn't have to applaud. She said Birmingham audiences were tough. And she said, I made the big mistake of going out on the stage and singing my cabaret numbers. She had music hall audiences who were predominantly working class. Cabarets were middle class, upper class. Music halls is a completely different thing altogether, and they were working class, and they gave her the bird, what was called the bird. Get off, we don't like you. And she said, I learned that you can't sing sophisticated cabaret songs in music halls. So she adapted. She started to learn more popular songs that those audiences would love, and that's how she progressed. It led to television, it led to films and musical theatre.
That's awesome. I was so enthralled with that I nearly forgot about my next question. There's a question in regards to the building in which Elisabeth is residing in episode 5. It says it's the building upon which viewers can now go and see the blue plaque dedicated to her. What are the key events in Elisabeth's life that occurred while she was staying here? What would her home life have looked like in this new UK settled home she made for herself?
I can tell you, because when I met her for the first time in 1982, she invited me to her home. Her home then wasn't very far. She lived in the flat where the English Heritage blue plaque is, Ovington Square, or Ovington Street. And it was just a small flat. She lived there for about 3 or 4 years and then moved to a place called Cottage Walk off Sloane Square, but that sadly had to be demolished in the 1950s. And she then moved to Capenhurst Close and in Kinnerton Street, off Kinnerton Street in Belgravia. I mean, we're talking about posh. So she invited me. I wrote her a fan letter and she phoned me up and said, come and see me. I'd love to meet you. Because she was very gregarious, very open. And I went to her home, and this would have been in 1982 in Capenhurst Close. And she had the same furnishings in her home that she'd had in the 1930s. So I can tell you quite honestly that it was like stepping back in time. She had Art Deco furniture. I mean, this settee, I'd never seen a settee like it. It was this huge square Art Deco, and it was a bit musty, I must admit. I feel bad saying that, although she's not with us, but maybe she is. Sorry, Elisabeth, but it was elegant. All of her furnishings were elegant, but very much out of the 1930s. It was almost as though she had never bothered to buy any furniture after the. So it was well made because it had lasted so long. And the walls in her living room were painted a sort of dusky pink, really beautiful. She had the most beautiful furnishings, ornaments, books, a baby grand piano. I mean, they call it a baby grand, which confused me because it was huge. Black, sort of glossy, shiny piano in her living room with a little Abdullah doll on the top, which had been a gift in 1933 from Gertrude Lawrence when they were in the Nymph show together. So, and she had music sheets stacked up on the floor, and this beautiful portrait on the wall that had been done by an artist called Gerald Brockhurst, which I'm now pleased to say is now in the National Portrait Gallery collection. Beautiful, beautiful portrait that was done in London in 1935. So it was a very private close, Capenhurst Close. It was very private. A member of the royal family, who I shan't mention the name, lived upstairs. So she lived in a very exclusive part of London. And I'm from Peckham. I'm from a council flat. And to me, it was like, okay. But, you know, I was very nervous, but she was so friendly and so open and warm. She hated talking about herself. She wanted me to talk about myself. And she was never one to talk about herself. So it was very difficult to interview her or talk to her about her career. But over time, that once she could could trust me and open up a bit more. But you still didn't go too closely into her private life. You didn't ask about her private life, only her professional life. But she was very modest. She could never understand why anyone would want to interview her or admire her. Very, very modest person.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, wow. She sounds so exciting, and I think we'll ask you a bit more about sort of your personal memories of her towards the end, because I feel like that's just the most beautiful way to finish. But I just wanted to know a bit more about her film career and her experience in the film world, because sort of the time that we focus on in the episode, she's she's done a little bit, but she'd love to sort of go and do more. And it's sort of about, yeah, go on, Elisabeth, go and take them all on. So did she tell you anything about her experiences on film sets or anything?
She actually didn't do that many films. It was very difficult for the British film industry to find work for her because she was a woman of colour, and that there weren't, and this was in the days when a lot of black artists, if they were in British films, were stereotyped. And so, but she actually struck lucky because she did a couple of guest appearances in, as I said, musical review type films. The very first film she did was called 1934. It was called Death at Broadcasting House. It was a crime thriller set in BBC's Broadcasting House. and she just appears very briefly with a band and sings a song, which is absolutely lovely. It's the first time she was captured on film. But she said the film was terrible. She said they should have, when they released it, she said they should have cut out all the words and just called it Death. Yeah, I had a great sense of humour. But it did lead on. Paul Robeson was, as I said, a big star, one of the biggest stars, black or white, in Britain at that time. And he was making films as a star actor. But they needed a black leading lady for him. So they asked Elisabeth if she would do this film with him called Song of Freedom, a very interesting film, British film made in 1936. He couldn't get this kind of work in Hollywood, in American films, because they were so racist and stereotypical, the kind of images. He hated that. But in Britain, he was given starring roles, and Elisabeth was his leading lady in 2 films. Song of Freedom, she played his wife. They're living in a working class Dockland community in East London. But he discovers he's the descendant of an African king. He wants to go to Africa. And because he's Paul Robeson and he sings, every so often a song is dropped into the narrative. But in the second film, it's a completely different film. It's set on the Marseille waterfront. And Robeson is sort of living in this, again, very multicultural community, and Elisabeth is the local singer in a cafe, and they have a romance, and it's absolutely lovely. But she does get a couple of solo songs in the film, as well as Paul Robeson singing solo, but they don't do a duet, which is a great shame. But they do appear together in some musical sequences, and a very low budget film. Elisabeth actually didn't like it, but when I saw it for the first time, I absolutely loved it. It was called Big Fella. That was the second film they did together. But then after that, Elisabeth did make kind of appearances in cabaret sequences in a number of British films, like Dead of Night, some classic films. But then after Dead of Night, she didn't really do any films. And I asked her, why did your film career end in 1945? And she said, they didn't ask me. That was like, she was never one to, she wasn't ambitious. She didn't get her agent, oh, get me that part in a film or get me into a film. She wasn't that type of person. If they came to her and offered her work and she liked the job, she would do it. But she was never ambitious. She was very modest and would never, that's what she told me. So she didn't really, apart from 1 or 2 exceptions, make another film until 1979, when she made that famous film appearance in The Tempest, Shakespeare's The Tempest, for the director Derek Jarman. And she comes on at the wedding feast of Miranda and Ferdinand in this outlandish but beautiful costume and sings Stormy Weather. which of course is what Elisabeth Welch would do in Shakespeare's The Tempest. And she used to laugh her head off. And she had friends. When I was with her that very first time in 1982, she said friends have hate the film, because Derek Jarman was an avant-garde experimental filmmaker. I actually loved the film, but a lot of people at the time hated it, traditionalists, and they would phone Elisabeth up if they knew her and say, Elisabeth, why don't they just take your sequence out and release it on its own? And she used to laugh her head off, but she loved Derek Jarman, this avant-garde, openly gay director at a time when film directors in Britain were not openly gay. It was a very different time. And that really kind of brought in the Renaissance, as I call it, in her career in the 1980s, which is where she came back into the public sort of domain.
The 1980s sounds like it was kicking. I'm definitely going to have to check out some of these names that you're dropping in films. Hopefully they're accessible still now.
Yeah.
So towards the end of the episode 5, the interview between Elisabeth and Ada is interrupted by another interviewer from Melody Maker. Can you tell us a bit more about what actually happened in this infamous interview?
I've seen it in Melody Maker, 1934. She kept a copy of it in her scrapbook. I understand what happened. She hated being interviewed. She really did. She was one of those artists that you know, if she was asked to sing in a cabaret show or a review or a charity show, she used to do a lot of those big charity, all-star charity galas in her later life. She would do it. She would sing on the radio, so on and so forth. But interview, ooh, no. She was very private, very, very private. And when I read that particular interview, if you want to call it that, I could well understand why she was so frosty and quite rude, I thought, to this interviewer, who was doing their best to kind of do their job. I mean, that's what they do. That's what interviewers from journals, newspapers like Melody Maker do.
No, I think when I was doing the research for this, I was lucky enough to sort of see the original, the application for her blue plaque, and it had sort of various anecdotes about her life, and that thing about the interview was in there, and I just thought, it says so specifically it lasted 4.5 minutes. And I just thought, I mean, I haven't got access to this interview, but it would just be the perfect thing to fit into a short YouTube episode and just imagine what happened. And I'm so glad that, like, the way she actually behaved in that interview is sort of lines up with what happens in our episode.
Well, when I think trying to be objective, which is difficult, if I'd read that and didn't know her personally, I would have thought she was incredibly rude. But
yeah,
knowing her as I did when I read that interview, I understood what was going on. I mean, there's still an element of rudeness, which was not like her. So there must have been something else going on. Maybe she got out of bed the wrong side, and also she hated being woken up in the morning. I got into trouble for that because she would not rise until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She would go to bed at 4 o'clock in the morning, and sleep through till 2 o'clock, and you never ever phoned her. Even her agent was told, don't ring me till 2 o'clock for work. And and I remember her being upset with me because I sent her a photograph to sign in a big hardback envelope, and the postman couldn't get it in the post box, so he banged and banged and banged on the door until she came down and answered it. And she gave me a bit of a ticking off on the phone, but she was okay about it. She still signed it and sent it back because I put a stamped addressed envelope inside. So I knew that there were certain boundaries with Elisabeth that you didn't cross. You didn't phone her before 2 o'clock. But if you phoned her at like 11 o'clock at night, I remember doing that once, and she was really chatty, really awake. And she put it down to partly being in the theatre, because of course in the theatre, all her life she would be doing performances until 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, and very hard to come down and fall asleep when you get home. So she got into the habit of staying awake until 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. and then falling asleep until the afternoon.
So Ada leaves the phone call encouraging Elisabeth to keep pushing her career into new heights. So like we were talking before, the push into the film industry further. Can you tell us about the significance of Elisabeth's work in music, film and radio?
Well, certainly in film, if you do what I've done and compare her to African American women in Hollywood films of the time, MGM, Metro Goldwyn Mayer, the big studio in Hollywood, put under contract a young singer called Lena Horne in 1942. But Lena Horne, even though she had a 7-year contract, and MGM were good to her in some respects, they would never allow her to appear on screen with white musicians. That was just not allowed in those days. And that's true of all black artists who went to Hollywood at that time, unless they were playing Mammy in Gone with the Wind or some subservient servant in a comedy film. If they were singers like Ella Fitzgerald or Billie Holiday, they would never be allowed to sing with white musicians. Elisabeth, in the British film industry, in the few films that she did make it at the same time as Lena Horne in Hollywood, there was no problem. So you look at Elisabeth in some of those cabaret sequences, and they are right back to 1930s. There's one very early British Technicolor film that was made in 1937 called Over the Moon. Merle Oberon and Rex Harrison are the stars, and Elisabeth does this fantastic cabaret sequence number. Red Hot Annabelle is the song, but she's with a white band. That would never have been allowed in Hollywood. So she was a trailblazer in that respect. And in fact, in that respect, I nominated her many years ago to America's Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame. Now, they'd honored everyone: Sidney Poitier, Paul Robeson, many, many people. Elisabeth was still alive at the time, but they'd never honored any black artist for British films. So I wrote to them in California, and they readily agreed that Elisabeth should be honoured. And it was wonderful because although she didn't want to travel all that way to receive an award, they filmed her at her home in London receiving the plaque, the Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame plaque. And that was quite a breakthrough because she was the only British black artist to receive that particular award for British cinema appearances. And then they kind of folded a few years later, so she was the only one. But they recognised in America, and I wish they'd recognised it more widely, just how important she was and significant she was in those British films. And radio, as I say, her radio career began in 1933. And I, in fact, was as far as I can remember, the very last person to interview her for a BBC radio programme, and that was when she was 90. In 1994, I interviewed her for a BBC radio documentary that I made about a celebration of black musical theatre in the West End. And she was always happy for me to go to her home and interview her. When I say interview, I mean interview her about her career, about professional people that she'd worked with. She was happy to do that, and we had some great times doing that. So that's 60 years, isn't it? So she had a 60-year career in BBC radio, which is phenomenal.
Yeah, incredible. That actually leads us perfectly on to the next question, because as I said earlier, and as we've heard throughout all of your answers, you obviously knew her, and we're in an extremely lucky position to be able to speak to someone who knew the person that this episode is focused on. So can you just tell us a bit more about your memories of her and what she was like as a person to be around? You've already alluded to a lot of it, but just your sort of lasting sort of image and memory of her.
Her sense of humour. She had the most wonderful sense of humour. She stayed away from politics. She hated politics, so don't mention politics. Because I remember I wanted to talk to her about a show she was doing in London, a tribute to Cole Porter. And it was for the Pink Paper, and the Pink Paper was a gay newspaper. And I remember phoning her up and saying, I want to interview for the Pink Paper. Oh, not those bloody communists. She said, I'm not talking to you about for them. And I said, no, it's not a communist newspaper. It's a gay newspaper. Oh, that's all right. That's all right. It was politics that she didn't entertain. But if you steered off that subject and just talked about just life in general. But as I say, my overriding memory is her wonderful sense of humour. And you could hear her laugh like 100 miles away. I remember we were meeting up at the British Film Institute one day to see one of her films that a mutual friend of ours had arranged a screening of one of her old British films, just for the three of us. And you could hear her laugh all the way down Dean Street in Soho. Because somebody had made her laugh, and you could hear this laugh, and it was true. She had the loudest laugh you can ever imagine, and that's how I remember. If you could make her laugh and keep her happy, that was her disposition. She could have her serious side. You know, she could have moments when she wanted to be very private and not talk to people. You know, we all have that, but she was a people person, and as long as you steered off politics and could make her laugh, and that was the secret of getting on with Elisabeth. That's how I remember her, and many phone calls. You know, it's. I remember I was watching the film Finian's Rainbow on telly with Petula Clark and Fred Astaire, and she phoned up in the middle of this film and she said, oh, have I disturbed you? I said, oh, I'm just watching Finian's Rainbow. Oh, she said, that bloody thing. She said, it got terrible reviews when it came out. They should have been worse. And I just remember these moments, and they were hysterically funny. It's her sense of humour. I could probably think of many others, but it's hard to remember them all at once.
It's lovely that you.
I kind of saw a side to her that the public didn't see. On stage, she was something else, but but off stage, she was a wonderful person to know.
It's lovely that you bring up the phone calls and the intimate, like, funny and joyful times you spent on those, because the last question is to ask, if you had the opportunity to call her today, what would you ask her, or what would you tell her?
I would probably shy away from telling her that I'd written her biography or was doing this interview, because she would probably not be amused very much, because it would be too public. You know, she's a very private person, and I don't know. It's a very difficult question to answer. All I would say is that just talk about whatever comes into my head or her head, and as long as we could have a laugh on the phone about something, she was, you know, she was just that kind of person. You could phone her up, as long as it wasn't in the morning, and you'd find, and I don't think I ever phoned her and found her grumpy or miserable. She would, once it registered who you were, then you would start a conversation, and as I say, she was always interested in the other person. She was never interested in talking about herself, so she would probably ask me a question more than me ask her. She would say, what are you doing now, what are you working on, and have you written any books lately, and that kind of thing, and then you'd sort of chat, and those moments were very special. And I'd love that to happen again, but of course it can't.
Yeah, I think it's so amazing to have, like, obviously we've sort of used this series, and we've just we've used the a phone call as a way to sort of imagine what these people would have been like and try and convey their significance to young people now. And I think it's so cool to actually get to speak to someone who did have phone calls with her and does know what she was like on the phone.
Oh, you're welcome. But can I show? Am I allowed to bring the signed thing over?
Yeah, sure.
I better not drop it, because, just in case. just in case anyone watching this is thinking I'm making it all up, I'm not.
There she is.
This is 1989. She released an album, Elisabeth Welch, This Thing Called Love, and it's all the famous love songs, including Cole Porter, Lennon and McCartney. And I don't know whether you can see, she signed it. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
You can. What does she say? Dear Stephen, hope you enjoy these. Love, Elisabeth Welch. And underneath she wrote, Liz. Isn't that lovely? And of course, I loved that so much. I had it mounted and framed, but not before. I had a cat. I mean, people are going to think I'm weird now, but I had a cat in 1985, a kitten, and I called her Lizzie in her honour. And Lizzie lived to be 17, God bless her. But when I brought that home, you can't see it because it's too small. She bit it.
Oh, no.
Her teeth marks are still in the corner. She just went, I put it down on the settee to do something, and she just went straight up to it and bit it. But I realised that was my cat, Lizzie, making sure she wasn't forgotten either. So every time I looked at it on the wall, I looked for these little tiny pinprick holes where she bit the corner of this album.
All the memories stored in one item.
The memories, I know. But they're lovely, lovely memories. I'm very blessed to have known someone as extraordinary as her, and taught me a lot as well. Not taught me anything overtly. It was just, you know, when you make friends with someone in your life, you learn things from them. And she was much older than me and wiser, and had lived a long and happy life, and so you learn from that example, never to judge people, and never to and always to keep a sense of humour, no matter how serious things get. And we've been going through some serious times, you know, in the last year or so, but to keep that sense of humour, very important.
Yeah, I don't want it to end, but I kind of have to. But it's been so lovely speaking to you, Stephen, and also to you, Tatenda. It's just been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I've had a lovely time. I hope everybody's enjoyed watching it. And yeah, make sure you join us next time for episode 6, which is the last episode, where we're talking about Noor Eniat Khan. But thanks everyone again, and yeah, see you next time.
See ya.
Okay. And